welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to share with you the emboss resist technique 3 different ways. I'm going to be using Joy Clair Stamps and Versafine Clair ink, the brand new ink pads that have launched a few months ago. Now I have 3 different colors that I'm going to be using today: Charming Pink, Nocturne, and Green Oasis. Now these ink pads are stackable right on top of each other. These are full-size ink pads, and you can see how well they kind of interlock together just by stacking one on top of the other. So if you're in a small space like me and you knock things over a lot, these aren't going to fall apart on you, and the caps stay on really securely too. This is a pigment ink, and it says on the package that a white rim kind of on the bottom of the ink pad it's normal. Now, there's a look at that white rim just to give you an idea of what you get whenever you get this ink pad, just so you're not freaking out whenever you see that and you're thinking I didn't get a lot of ink. These are still really juicy. You can see just how juicy they are when I press my finger up against that ink pad. You've got the ink seeping out the sides, and just by tapping my fingertip is completely covered. There's a look at the Charming Pink ink pad. Now that one doesn't have the white rim quite as bad. And then also the Green Oasis. And I'll go ahead and tap my finger in this one as well. This one is really, really pigmented and juicy too. Some of the ink has already gotten out on this side too. You can see that. Now these are pigment ink, so you can heat emboss with them, and that's what I'm going to be doing today. My favorite way to heat emboss with these is with clear embossing powder. You can use any sort of clear embossing powder. You could even use like a pearl embossing powder to get a really pretty effect, but I'm just going to be using clear today. Now for my first 2 cards, I'm going to be using Joy Clair Stamps background stamps. I've got Crackle on the left and Broken Brick on the right. These measure 4 inches by 6 inches, or about 5 3/4 actually. But these will go not quite across a standard A2 card base, but they will get the length of it. Now I'm going to be using these without my Misty today. The easiest way to use these is probably, well, I take that back. You can use these with the Misty if you want to get a couple stamps out of them, but this is probably the easiest way that I'm going to show you. So I take the wrapper off of my stamp and I take the first piece of acetate off. I don't take the stamp off of the backing that it comes on. I just leave that on there, and I rarely ever take the background stamps off. I'm going to ink that up with some of that Versafine Clair ink in the Nocturne color. I want to say Versafine Onyx Black because that's what I'm so used to using, but this is Nocturne. And I'm going to go ahead and just stamp this off on a piece of scrap paper. Now that's only because this is a brand new stamp. I haven't used it before, and I don't want to go in first to my card base that I'm going to be using, or my card panel. Now I have a plain white cardstock panel here that I'm going to be stamping on. This is an A2 size card panel, so 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I'm going to go ahead and ink this stamp up again with that ink pad. I'm going to make sure I get this really, really well, because I'm only going to get one time to stamp this since I am doing it without a stamp positioner. So I want to make sure I get the entire surface area covered with ink. So once I have that completely covered with ink, I'm going to go ahead and take my piece of cardstock, line it up over that stamp, and then I'll go ahead and just press it straight down onto the stamp and not move it around at all. Then I'll bring that scrap piece of paper that I was using before and place it right over the top of that. Now you want to always keep a hand on this stamp so it doesn't move or shift around on you. And also, if you can't press down hard enough with your hands, use a brayer. That's going to give you a nice even pressure. It's going to make sure you get all those edges. It really does help a lot with giving it enough pressure and even pressure to use this tool. I just have a small one. I think this cost around $5 or $6 from my local craft store, but you can use even like a rolling pin if you had that. That might help, but you do need 2 hands for that, so it might be a little tricky. Now once I have it pressed down and I'm sure I've gotten all the coverage, I'm going to go ahead and peel that off the stamp, and there I have that Broken Brick background perfectly stamped on my cardstock. Now this is a pigment ink, so it stays wet long enough for me to go ahead and heat emboss over that, and I will be doing that with clear embossing powder. I'm embossing the entire thing, so I'm sprinkling this over a coffee filter. I just find that's the easiest way to put embossing powder on any surface, but especially large surfaces. It catches it all. You can funnel it back into your container really easily. And then any that doesn't want to go back into the container that has a little bit of that static clean, you can just crumple up that coffee filter and toss it. And it's not going to break the bank. Now I'm going to go ahead and heat emboss this with my heat gun. I've let it heat up for about 30 seconds before I brought it to the paper, and there's a nice close-up of that melting. I never get tired of watching embossing powder melt. It's one of the first techniques I learned. I was so excited to get my first embossing gun and my first embossing powder, and it still amazes me that I am able to do this on my own cards. There's a closer look at that raised kind of the raisedness, the the raised area you get when you emboss. It really is awesome. So I'm going to move on to my next panel. Now this panel I'm going to be stamping onto watercolor paper. Watercolor paper can be a little bit tricky sometimes. This watercolor paper I'm using does have quite a bit of texture on it, but this crackle background really saves me because it's not a perfectly kind of symmetrical stamp. So I'm using the crackle background, like I said, doing exactly the same thing, inking up the stamp, making sure I get it completely covered. Then I'll go ahead and place that watercolor paper, the side I want stamped on, down towards the stamp and just hold it in place while I put a piece of scrap paper over the top. I did prep this surface with my embossing bag, and I did go ahead and stamp this one off onto a scrap piece of paper as well. Now, if you don't have a brayer and you still want to get that nice even pressure, grab an acrylic block and use that to press down. This works really well as well, and you can get enough pressure out of that. This is a little bit harder on your hands, so if you do have some hand troubles, you might want to stick with the brayer, but if you don't have a brayer, this works to get that really even pressure too, or you can just use your hands. I'll go ahead and move that scrap piece of paper and then peel up my background, and there's that crackle background all stamped out. I love the way the texture looks with this stamp. It didn't stamp perfectly. I didn't expect it to, but it's perfect for me for what I'm going for. So to clean these, I just don't even take them off the backing paper. I spritz them with a little bit of water and wipe them down with a cloth, put them back in their packaging, and they're good to go. Now for my third background, it's going to be a little bit different. I'm using the God's Masterpiece stamp set from the Joy Clair Stamps Color by Face series, and I'm stamping again on an A2 card panel from plain white cardstock. I prep my surface with my embossing bag, and now I'm going to be stamping those paint splatters that you've seen in the stamp set that I showed just a few seconds ago. Except this time I'm going to be using the Charming Pink and the Green Oasis inks. Now these are pigment inks again, so they stay wet for a pretty significant amount of time. So I'm going to be able to stamp quite a few of these stamps and get a complete background before I need to heat and emboss the whole thing. So I'm starting off with these big splotches, and I am going to stamp the entire background. I'm leaving a few open spaces because I'll bring in some smaller splotches in just a moment, but I'm just switching quickly back and forth between the green and the pink inks, making sure I get kind of a good variety of these all over the card. Now, heat embossing with colored pigment inks is one of my favorite ways to heat emboss in color. This way, I do not have to have a ton of different embossing color powders. I just don't have the space to store them, and it allows me to do more techniques with my ink, to have the ink pads rather than the colored embossing powder. Colored embossing powder you can do a few techniques with, but just not as many as you can get with your pigment ink pads. So if I had to choose, I'd go with pigment ink always and clear embossing powder than I would with colored embossing powders. It just works out better for me in my craft space with the limited amount of space I have. So I covered those first splotches with the clear embossing powder, heat set all those very quickly, then came back in with the smaller splotches, filled in those white areas, and heat emboss those as well. Now, the first way I'm going to show you to do the emboss resist technique is with sprays. I am using the firework sprays from Imagine Crafts. These are beautiful pigmented sprays, highly pigmented, but they've got a little bit of shine to them. I'm using Tuxedo Black here, and if you hold them closer to the paper, you get more of a fireworks effect, like a really big splotch. If you hold them further away, you get sort of a fine mist. So that's what I'm doing here. The one thing I will say about these sprays, use them in a box. Do not spray in an open area. This stuff will go everywhere. I set that aside to dry. I actually did my other card bases or panels before I came back to this. And then I just blotted up what was left on those places that I had embossed. All that embossing resists that spray. It's not going to let it go underneath the ink at all. And then you can wipe away what's left on top of it, and you've got this beautiful splattered background. It's that easy to do. Now my next emboss resist is going to be done with watercolor markers. I'm using these Arteza brushes. You can use Zigs, you can use distress markers, you can use, I have the Spectrum Noir that I've done this with that are beautiful. Any sort of watercolor brush you can do this with, or you can just scribble out some watercolors onto a palette and do it with that too. This is just what's easiest for me, and I wanted to do a rainbow, so I'm going to be doing that very quickly with these. So I picked out some rainbow colors, and I'm just scribbling them down in rainbow order, so my Roy G. Biv. Now I had a little bit of trouble getting this even, so I'm going to go back in and kind of even this up, making sure the colors overlap. Now at this point I haven't added any water to this, but I'm going to come in with a water brush. This just has clean water in it. If you wanted to make this a little sparkly, you could add in some Perfect Pearls mist or some of the shimmer spray from Imagine Crafts. That stuff is gorgeous. But I'm going to go ahead and just blend this out very quickly. Now before I move on to two different colors, like I'm going between green and yellow now, I want to go ahead and scribble off my brush so I don't contaminate that with any of the orange and end up with mud. That really is key to getting these rainbow backgrounds to look pretty and not get mud out of them, is to remove color from your brush as you go along. You don't want to just swipe water down, or you will end up with mud at the purple end. So I just quickly scribbled that across, making sure to wipe my brush, and then I'm going to sit that aside and let it dry. That will dry beautifully if I don't touch it with my heat gun, and plus I didn't want to chance melting that heat powder or that embossing powder again. So my third way of embossed resist is going to be with inks. I am using distress inks, but you can use any blendable ink. You could use the pigment inks. You could use any kind of ink that you like to blend with. This is just what I had on hand that goes with the brick background look. So I'm starting off with some of the Fired Brick, such an appropriate name, to go in and add some color over this. Now again, anywhere that embossing is, it's going to resist the color. It's going to stay nice and black. You're not going to get any ink underneath that. Now I'm also going to come in with a little bit of Barn Door ink. This is a nice kind of rusty orangey red color, and that's just going to give a little bit more depth, a little bit more color to this background. I'm just switching between the two here, adding splotches of the color here and there. If you've ever looked at bricks, they're not all one color. They've got a lot of dimension, a lot of texture. So I really want to add that in to this background. I'm also going to come in just a moment and add a little bit of, you could use Vintage Photo. I think I used Walnut Stain actually, but just a little bit of brown just to deepen up those colors and really give it a nice deep dark look in just a few of the places here and there. You don't want to go too heavy-handed with the brown, but it does add a gorgeous effect, and this is a great way to kind of distress those edges. Now at a certain point you're going to have to pull out a piece of scrap cardstock and use that to hold on to. Distress ink just moves around with even the oils on your finger, but really with water. But the oils on your finger will pick up that color. It'll start to shift it around. You'll get fingerprints on your project. So when you're layering up a lot of colors like this, really saturating the paper, make sure you use a piece of scrap paper just to hold it in place. Now I wanted to add a few splotches to this background, so I'm going to take some clean water and a paintbrush and just flick on some water droplets. Now I let mine sit for a long time because this is cardstock. This works better on watercolor paper, but I wanted to do it on cardstock. It gives a different look on cardstock. It doesn't pull up all of the color. It's not completely white, but it does add a nice texture to it, and it's nice and subtle. So I love the way this looks. Now there are a look at all three of the backgrounds completed. So I've got my inks, I've got my watercolors, and I've got my sprays, all with the Emboss Resist technique with these Versafine Clair inks that are just gorgeous. Now I went ahead and finished off these cards, some of them off camera. This first one, I finished it off with the God's Masterpiece stamp set. I used the little easel. My husband makes fun of the way I say that word easel. But I used that and I made a little image on there with the stamps that are included in the stamp set. I also went ahead and stamped the woman, colored her in with some alcohol markers. I stamped her with the Versafine Clair ink and colored her in with alcohol markers. These work with my alcohol markers, which is amazing. It's kind of like the all-around in one ink that I really, really love and have been looking for. I'm going to go ahead and stamp the sentiment on the inside of the card. It's actually a Bible verse. There you can see it stamped. I did use my MISTI for that because I put so much work into the front of the card. I didn't want to mess it up on the inside. So I went ahead and stamped that with my MISTI. Here's a final look at the card all put together. I did pop the woman up to give it a little bit of dimension. I stamped the easel on a circle die, cut that out to make sure it fit the rectangle that I popped onto an A2 top folding card base, and then I moved on to my next cards. These panels, like I said, the backgrounds don't completely fill an A2 card base. So I went ahead and cut these down, popped them onto side folding A2 card bases. I cut some white cardstock panels that measure 2 inches by, I believe, 3.5 inches. And then I cut panels from black cardstock that are going to be mats that are slightly larger than that. I'm going to be using the Inspirational Arrows stamp set from Joy Clair Stamps. And I am stamping one on the outside, so on those white cardstock panels. And then I'm going to stamp one that kind of matches on the inside. So for this one, I stamped Be Strong on the outside, matted it with that black mat, popped it all onto a card base, and on the inside, I stamped Have Faith. So it says Be Strong, Have Faith. I love that these arrows kind of go together. I did the exact same thing on my second card. So it says Take Chances on the outside, and then on the inside it says Things Will Happen. Again, I matted that cardstock panel with some black cardstock, popped everything onto an A2 side folding card base, and that card was finished as well. There's a look at the inside of that. I love those arrows. You could even color them in for some more color, but I like the plain black and white look. Here is a final look at all three of the cards. I hope you guys enjoyed this video of 3 different ways you can use the Emboss Resist technique with lots of different Imagine Craft products, but especially those new Versafine Clair inks and your Joy Clair stamps as well. Thank you guys so much for watching today. There are a few links on the left side of your screen you can click on. Happy crafting!